Okay, I know what you're gonna say. I swear, it's not that bad. It just looks bad. It's fine. It looks really bad, but it's fine. I promise you it's fine. Just trust me on this. Yeah, so this is my server. Uh NAS, kind of. Whatever you want to call it. It is technically a server because I am running a media server off of this, but it is also mostly just a NAS as well. Whatever you want to call it, I really don't care. It looks bad. I fully embrace that, but it actually has been an extremely rock solid, reliable server for me for well over a year. But this isn't the original incarnation of this monstrosity, because I've actually been messing around with having sort of a file server NAS for years. This just happens to be the latest incarnation of my messing about, and we'll go into the history that I have with trying to do file servers and whatnot. But first, the main reason that this thing is even out here is because I need to clean it. This thing's been deployed for like a year. It's been running 24/7 basically that entire time, and it needs to get cleaned. Although I will say, it's not quite as bad as I thought it would be. I expected the CPU heatsink to be way worse than that. I mean, all things considered, for basically an entire year of constant use, that really isn't that bad, but I think the power supply is going to be kind of worse than the CPU heatsink, and also there's quite a bit of surface dust down there, and I promise this will all be explained. All right, well, that's done. It was better and worse than I expected. CPU heatsink, yeah, it wasn't that bad. Power supply, like I thought, was a bit more dusty because the power supply fan actually spins at like full speed all the time because it's not that great of a power supply, but it works. So let's get into my history a little bit with servers. I've never touched a single real server, I don't think, in my life, at least that I can think of. Well, kind of. I've touched some server motherboards, but I've never actually touched like a whole complete server. So yeah, I really have no actual enterprise server experience, as you can probably tell. So I just want to say probably back in like 2017, 2018, I got the idea to build a Windows 2000 file server. Windows 2000 did not work out because of Windows 2000 kind of has a weird 137 gigabyte hard drive limit. There's ways to get around it, but it was annoying. I ended up putting XP on it, and if you're wondering why I was running XP, it's because it was a Pentium 4 Dell. I think it was a Dimension E310, and there was just so many problems with choosing that machine as my file server. First of all, I couldn't run it all the time because Pentium 4, it didn't have any sort of RAID. It was just like one, and I think later I did add a second hard drive. This was kind of a server mainly meant as like a file backup, not really meant for constant access, which was good because I wasn't leaving it on all the time. And the third thing that absolutely killed this thing from ever actually being useful, it only had a 100 megabit Ethernet controller, which is just absolutely unusable for any sort of modern, data at all. It was fine in the early 2000s when files were generally a lot smaller, hard drives were smaller. If you're copying like 20 gigabytes at a time, you actually could walk away, go eat lunch, and come back, and it would maybe be done by then. And obviously, it was running XP, not really the most secure thing, even though it wasn't, connected to the internet per se. It was connected to the local network, which does have a firewall on it, but still, it wasn't really the best solution, as you would probably expect. I kind of abandoned the idea for several years until about 2022, when I decided to kind of actually jump into this properly, because I started learning more about Open Media Vault, which is what this is actually currently running. But I started out on Open Media Vault 5, which is a lot older than the current Open Media Vault 6. There was a lot of changes in there. But I started out on older OpenMedia Vault, and I did not start out with this hardware. What I actually started out with was this. This is a LGA 775 motherboard, MATX Asus. This is a nice little board. This was mainly a proof of concept experiment to kind of dip my toes, get used to the OpenMedia Vault, set up an experience, and just kind of, become adapted to it. Now, I wanted this to be low power because I wanted it to be able to run all the time, at least for a little while until I got, a better piece of hardware for the system. So I put a Celeron 430 in this thing, which is pretty much the lowest power LGA 775 chip you could get, those old single-core Celerons. Single-core Celeron, not even running at like 2 gigahertz. As you'd expect, it wasn't really the fastest, but it had a gigabit Ethernet controller, and honestly, running at least the older version of OpenMedia Vault, it was actually fine. Data transfer was fine, and after I got that all set up on here, I figured, you know what? I'm going to make the plunge. I'm going to buy some hard drives for this thing, and so I bought, one of them's kind of up here, 4 terabyte WD blue hard drives. Everyone's going to be yelling, why didn't you buy red drives? Those are the NAS drives. You're not supposed to be using the regular consumer hard drives. I know. It's okay, because it's in RAID 5, and as we all know, RAID just makes everything perfect. Definitely perfect. No issues could possibly arise from this scenario. Now, originally, I had these drives all mounted, only one space away from each other because it looked very nice and I really liked the way it looked. But eventually I started running into hard drive temperature related issues, particularly the 2 that were kind of in the middle of the sandwich. I'd wake up in the morning to having error emails sent to me from OpenMedia Vault saying that you've had a smart temperature error. The 2 middle drives were getting way over 50 degrees Celsius, which anything over 50 degrees C on a hard drive is very bad news. The lifespan really starts to drop quite significantly once it's running at any length for a temperature that high. So I was like, okay, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. I tried adding a fan in the front. There is an 80mm mount on this case. I'll touch on the case in just a second, but I tried adding a fan. That did absolutely nothing to help the issue. So I ended up spacing the hard drives further apart, and one of them is very haphazardly mounted into where a floppy drive is supposed to go in this case. And yes, the boot SSD is not mounted at all. And since this was all, a test initially, I figured, why not use this case that I have absolutely no other use for? Because, well, it's missing the side panels. I got this case, I think it had a socket A motherboard in it. I didn't really want to get rid of the case because it is a vintage case, but again, it has no side panels. So, what am I going to really use it for? It's missing all of the front covers except, this one. It's yellowed. I didn't want to just throw it away, so I figured, you know what, I'll mount this thing in there as, a temporary kind of thing. And as we all know, in IT, a temporary solution ends up becoming the permanent solution. Yeah, this all started out as a test. I did hook up all 4 of those 4 terabyte hard drives to this motherboard, maxed out all of the SATA ports, and even with, a software RAID 5 on this slow of a board, it actually wasn't that bad. Power consumption wasn't great because, even though it is a single-core, low clock speed Celeron, it's still a single-core, low clock speed Celeron that's 65 nanometers and was 16 whatever years old at the time. Now it's 18. I hate time. It actually was a nice proof of concept, at least just as a file server itself. And that's what it was for a few months. I did run this for a few months, which was longer, I think, than I initially intended. If you're wondering what the boot drive was for this, considering all 4 SATA ports were filled up, I did consider using an IDE drive because there is actually an IDE connector on this motherboard. But no, I was not an idiot. I used a flash drive. But what I was an idiot for is because I used an extremely old flash drive, some ancient 16 gigabyte flash drive I think I owned since 2015. I'm surprised it didn't fail because I used that flash drive as the main boot drive for way over a year through another hardware change. I don't even know how it didn't fail, but it somehow didn't. So Yay, I did make a backup image of the flash drive though. You can congratulate me. I wasn't a complete idiot. But speaking of that hardware change, I knew that this could not be the long-term solution. It only had 4 gigabytes of RAM. The power consumption was not great. Single core performance was also not great. And I wanted something that was a little bit better because I wanted to start messing around with Jellyfin, which, without getting too much into this, you can look it up. You probably already know what it is. Jellyfin Media Server, great open source media server, lets you put all of your, movies, TV shows in one central place, preferably, on like a server NAS thing that's running all the time. And I really wanted to mess around with it. But of course, old single core Celery boy up there is not going to cut it for that at all. So I knew I needed a hardware upgrade. But the problem was, I didn't really have much more money to spend on this thing because I dumped a lot of money on those hard drives. I could have built like an AM4 Athlon system. I do have an Athlon 3000G, but I was kind of using that at the time. I didn't really want to give that up and, put it in a system that's going to be running all the time. So what does late night eBay browsing and a budget of like $30 get you? It gets you this. This is a mini ITX BioStar motherboard with a dual-core Ivy Bridge Celeron that is soldered to the motherboard. Now, this is very clearly meant to be like an embedded system, probably for like a point-of-sale machine or something, but it had a lot of features that I really liked. One, it had 4 SATA ports, so I could hook up all my hard drives. I did carry the boot flash drive over to this system. It used DDR3 RAM instead of DDR2, which was nice because I could put more RAM in it if I wanted to, although I guess I still only put 4 gigs in here. I don't know how that happened, but I guess I only stuck with 4 gigs. I guess that was enough. All the connectors were standard ATX connectors. It had a full PCIe 16X slot, which I thought, hey, that'd be great if I, added like an HBA card or if I wanted to upgrade the Ethernet speed on this. Yes, I really was considering, upgrading this board. Okay, you can laugh all you want at the fact that I paid money for this. I paid like $30 for this. This worked extremely well. This ran the server for like a year. Power consumption was very low. It ran Jellyfin fantastically. I really don't have any complaints about it. It worked pretty well. It was quiet. You'd think this little fan would have gotten, pretty noisy. It actually wasn't. This was actually a perfectly usable system for me. And I like this little board. With that said, there was one issue with this, and that's the quick sync video support built into the Celeron. Now, this is an Ivy Bridge Celeron, so its quick sync abilities actually weren't that bad. It could do, H.264 decoding and encoding. But for Jellyfin, I really wanted to have something that was, capable of doing like HEVC or H.265, encoding, decoding. And of course, I just wanted something that was a little bit more powerful than this. I was starting to put, 4K content on the server. I really just wanted a better platform overall to, work with. And that brings us to the server as of today. So this is the current system. This is a Asus B150M-C, going back to MATX. And this is actually an LGA 1151. Okay, guys, I'm going to be honest. I don't know any of the Intel sockets really past LGA 775. Intel did an absolutely awful job with the naming for these sockets. I have no clue. I'm sorry. But this is actually a Kaby Lake system. This has a Pentium G4600. That's a dual-core Kaby Lake Pentium. And of course, because it has, rather modern power management features and whatnot, modern-ish. I mean, it's 2017. That's pretty dang modern for my standards. It actually is pretty power efficient. This runs pretty much 24/7, aside from, a few power outages we've had and leaving the house and for, a few days and just turning it off because why waste the power when no one's here? This thing has been rock stable. In fact, that BioStar motherboard, even the first, LGA 775 board, honestly, these have all been extremely rock stable. I've not had a single genuine crash with any of them. I've had a few software issues, maybe with some Jellyfin configuration and whatnot, but even that runs generally very rock stable. I don't have any complaints with this thing. It works so well that I really have no desire to upgrade or change this thing really at all. I don't think I would have upgraded the system even this far had I not wanted to try out Jellyfin. Jellyfin is just a fantastic open source project, and it's one of those things that you don't realize that you really need your own self-hosted media server until you actually try it out. And you're like, wow, how did I not do this sooner? This is fantastic. This makes life so much easier. And it's also just really fun if you really like messing with stuff like this. Normally, I hate messing with software. And I did kind of hate the configuration for some stuff, but once you get that over with, I actually found it really fun loading up all of my media on Jellyfin. But once I got all the configuration stuff out of the way, I actually found it really fun putting all of my media onto Jellyfin. This is still running the RAID 5, so for those not that familiar with RAID, you lose one of your drives to redundancy. So I could lose one of these hard drives, and all the data is still intact. If I lose two, I'm screwed. But I can lose one, and I'll be okay. I'm sure there are plenty of people that would love to tell me why RAID 5 is bad and I shouldn't use RAID 5 because XYZ RAID is better. RAID 6, you should have used RAID 1+0. You should have used ZFS. You shouldn't even be using Open Media Vault. You should be using TrueNAS or FreeNAS. I don't care. I really don't care because it works for me. Use what works for you and ignore everyone else. I did, of course, move to a proper boot SSD because this motherboard has, wow, 6 SATA ports. It has 6 SATA ports. It's like a real modern motherboard. So I could finally ditch the, old flash drive and move to this 120 gig, very low-end Kingston SSD that I have, but it works. I have a backup image of that. As you can see, this is a fairly low-end EVGA 500 watt, 80 plus white power supply, so absolutely bare bones. 500 watts, I mean, for this system is actually pretty overkill, but this was the best power supply that I really had that I was willing to sacrifice to the server, not have access to really, and that I would also trust with not burning my house down. So that's why that's in there. Cable management is non-existent because this is a case from like 2002. There's no options for cable management. The cable management includes some of it just stuck in the front drive bays, and most of it's just strewn about. You might think, wow, isn't that kind of bad considering that, you have no side panels for the system and it's just, it's just open? I mean, isn't that kind of dangerous for like, bumping cables and whatnot? Yeah, probably, but this thing basically just lives buried underneath my XP and Windows 7 machine, and I barely ever get to it, hence why it was not cleaned out for like over a year, because it's kind of a pain to pull out. And I figured since I'm pulling it out, I might as well make this video on it. So yes, just no side panels. It just sits like this, basically under a table, and I haven't had any issues with it yet. I guess we'll see how that turns out long term if I ever accidentally bump something in there. But yes, this is a Pentium G4600. It's, I think, the best Kaby Lake Pentium that they made for desktop. There might be one that's slightly better than this, like a G4650 or something like that. But this was a pretty good chip. I think I only paid like $10 for it, and because it's Kaby Lake, that was the first generation to have true like H.265 encoding and decoding. I think older generations of QuickSync had decoding, but not encoding. I wanted encoding, and also being able to do like HDR color changes and whatnot. I'm not getting into this whole thing. I barely have any HDR displays, but some of my content is HDR, so I needed to, have something to convert it on the fly from HDR to SDR to play on my, SDR displays. That's mainly why I wanted to, upgrade just to have better, codec and feature support and all that fun stuff. But yeah, that chip only cost me like $10 and it works perfectly fine in here. And this motherboard as well, I think it only cost me like $50, which was an amazing deal because it also came with a CPU. And honestly, if it had been a Kaby Lake chip, I would have left it in there. But unfortunately, it was a Skylake i3-6100. It would have been okay, again, but it was just one generation behind the QuickSync stuff that I wanted, so I ended up just grabbing the Pentium. But really, this wasn't that expensive of an upgrade. And because thankfully this is a DDR4 system, I could finally get, cheap memory. I think I just got like 2133. Yeah, I think it's just 2133 Samsung memory. Might be 2400, but I think it's 2133. 8 gigabytes in dual channel, so I finally have a memory upgrade. Not that I ever really needed the memory upgrade. Even running Jellyfin, this thing rarely uses more than 4 gigabytes of RAM anyways, from what I've seen, so I kind of didn't need to upgrade the RAM anyways, but we have the Intel stock cooler, which is surprisingly quiet. I did not realize how quiet these things actually are when there's like, a low power chip under them and there's like no load on it. Yeah, it's actually really, really quiet. The fan never spins down, unfortunately. I couldn't really find a fan profile that actually allows that to happen in the BIOS, but it's actually really fine. It's extremely quiet. The power supply fan is actually what's loud in this thing, and you can kind of hear it if it's completely quiet in the room that it's in, and there's like no ambient noise. You can kind of hear it running, but really it's such a non-issue that I really don't worry about it. Although having a passively cooled power supply would be very nice. And of course the hard drives do make, a little bit of noise when they're all running, but this thing spins up the hard drives maybe a few times a day, and it's really not that big of a deal, which is why I'm okay with running these, standard consumer blue hard drives instead of the red NAS ones, is because they just don't spin up all that frequently. I use Jellyfin daily, but really not enough that it's putting any sort of serious stress on these hard drives long term. And in terms of actually like backing up, files and stuff to this, like I back up all my videos and stuff to this, that's maybe like a couple times a week that I'm really doing anything on the server. So there's really not that much load going on these drives and on this, really on this system as a whole. And being, a semi-modern motherboard, I have, a decent bit of expansion if I ever wanted to. I have 2 full-size PCI Express slots, although the bottom one I think is only wired up by 8, but I think the top one is true 16x. It even has a legacy PCI slot, which that's neat, and a by 1 PCIe slot. So plenty of expansion that I can put in the future if I ever wanted to add like an HBA card or faster Ethernet controller, because this system still only has, a gigabit Ethernet controller, and it has quite a bit of, I/O on the back. If I ever wanted to, I could add USB hard drives to this. Not that I probably will, because it's usually more expensive and more cumbersome than just, sticking them inside the server itself. And I don't use any of this I/O like ever. The only things that are ever plugged into this thing is power and Ethernet. But it has a surprising amount of I/O. It has VGA, DVI, DisplayPort, and HDMI, which is fantastic. 4 USB 3, 2 USB 2, and dual PS2 ports. Honestly, this board is just really nice to have around. So if this board ever gets decommissioned from, being my server, it's still going to be really handy to have that board around. And yeah, that's basically it for the server. I don't really have anything else to add about this. The goal of this video is to show that you too can build a horrible looking server that's super reliable out of, hardware that was once hardware that you already had, and then you invested a bunch of money into it. It still looks bad, but it still runs good, but now it's better. So really, this isn't going to save you any money at all, but you can make it feel like you're saving money. I mean, I guess I did save money on the case, because I got the case for free, but yeah, I guess aside from that, this thing hasn't really actually been that cheap. But aside from that, if you actually do happen to have, more modern-ish hardware that's just kind of lying around, yeah, you can build yourself a NAS. You don't need to buy one of those, frankly, kind of expensive little NAS cubes or whatever that you see all the time advertised. While those are definitely nice and they're a lot more plug-and-play and easy to use than this, if you're fine with tinkering, Open Media Vault is really not that difficult to get set up, and this thing is definitely cheaper than one of those little NAS cubes, because I think one of those NAS box things usually costs like a few $100s, and they don't include hard drives. So yeah, you can save money doing something like this. And honestly, if you're just a home user, unless you really, really like cosplaying as an IT administrator, and you want, a full server rack with all of the server hardware that's extremely loud and power hungry, which I did not want, because one, I don't have room for it, and 2, I was not going to deal with the noise or the power consumption. Honestly, going with, just reliable consumer hardware like this can make a lot of sense for you, and I guess that's the message. I like my videos usually to have some sort of point. I guess that's the point. You too can build a server. Maybe try to get a case that has side panels, though. That's probably the one thing you probably shouldn't copy from me. But hey, maybe I inspired some of you to build your own server. I mean, there's definitely been worse servers than this. I did legitimately consider building a server out of like a laptop that had the screen broken one time. I'm glad I live in this timeline and not that one. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.